Welcome to another episode. Oh, didn't hear that voice. Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. An anomaly is something that's kind of a deviation from the straight and narrow. And I like to think that most all the shows we do are deviations from the straight and narrow. So Dave Jinks is with us tonight. Good to see you again, Dave.
Good to see you too, Dan.
Good to be seen. So several episodes back, we had the pleasure of talking with Reba Wissner, who's a professor of musicology. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. And Reba, besides being into music, was into two of my favorite TV shows, one of which we've already done a show on, The Outer Limits, and the other show that we're going to kind of pay homage to tonight is the Twilight Zone. So we're really happy to have Reba here with us to do that. So Reba, just give us a little bit of a sketch as to why you were into things like the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits, and why the music appealed to you. You want to start there?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back. So when I was 4 years old, I know this is way back, when I was 4, in New York City, and at the time we had a station, WPIX on Channel 11, that every morning used to play episodes of the Twilight Zone. And of course, this was in reruns. This was in the 80s, and my parents used to have it on. And the first episode I could actually actively remember seeing was 5 characters in search of an exit, which is kind of horrifying for, a 4-year-old, but there we are. And I remember kind of being really intrigued by the show. And I remember watching it every day. I don't always remember what episode I was seeing. And so I always loved the show. Whenever sci-fi would have the marathons on, I would watch the marathons. And then eventually, fast forward to me being in graduate school and about to be done with my doctorate, my advisor went on sabbatical and decided he didn't really want to do much that year. So I wound up having to kind of flounder. I was basically done with my dissertation, which was on 17th century Venetian opera. And I felt like I needed to be useful and do something useful. The grad student brain in me is kind of like, you need a job, so you need to actually keep researching. And so I was thinking about what I wanted to look at that was not 17th century Venetian opera, because I was quite frankly kind of sick of it at that point. And I was thinking, oh, the Twilight Zone. And then I started thinking about the music, and I started thinking about how there was very little like anyone had done on the music. And I had looked and there really was hardly anything at all. And I don't remember exactly how this played out, but I do remember that I somehow wound up getting in contact with a few people who were interested in the music, namely Bill Rozar, Bill Robel, and Carson Cohen. And when, kind of a little bit of a detour, but when CBS was cleaning out their archives, they decided they were going to try and dump all of their sheet music and all of their recordings and things. And so Bob Drasnin, who was a composer for the series, but also a music director, happened to be walking by the curb of CBS, according to this alleged story anyway, and saw all of this stuff on the curb. And he went inside and he asked what was happening. And they said, well, we don't need these scores or anything anymore, and we're just going to throw them out. And Bob Drasnin goes, oh, absolutely not. And he went to UCLA and got UCLA to take them in. And one of the conditions that I was told was that anyone who went in to UCLA to look at these scores could photocopy them without permissions. UCLA held up that end of the bargain for a while, in time for one of those people who I was in contact with to actually photocopy every single score for every single episode. And so as I found out when I got in contact with them, they had all of the scores. And at the time I was living in New York City, and I said, this is perfect. And so he was willing, Carson Cohen was absolutely willing to send me what he had. And so I had all of the scores, and I'm still part of like email chains with Carson and a few others and Bill, of like passing around new recordings and studio recordings of things that the people are just finding. But that initial contact is what led me to actually obtain the research materials that I needed to embark on that project, because I was really fascinated about the way the music worked. I didn't know really much about anything related to television music or even film music at that point. So everything I did was self-taught. And so that's when as I started doing the research, I started realizing how much complexity there was, the whole music library system with reuse of cues and how that actually works, and why, couple of different episodes might have the same music in them, and how that played out. And so that's how I actually got started. And it was really like, I fell in love with the series at 4 years old. And then when I got to be in my 20s, I realized there was nothing on it, and I was able to access those materials, which was a lot harder with the Outer Limits stuff. If you remember, we were talking about the Outer Limits stuff, how finding those things in the archives and getting those was just an absolute nightmare. This was easy peasy because I had help.
One of the things I'm recalling from our discussion about the Outer Limits, there were really some unique musical bits of somebody actually made a part of the soundtrack of one of the episodes using a vacuum cleaner. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yep, it was the Onafets.
Yeah, is there anything like that in the Twilight Zone?
No, everything is kind of very traditional. There's not even a theremin. So usually there's a perception that there's at least a theremin in the Twilight Zone, which for those who aren't familiar with the theremin, it's basically the instrument that you play without touching it. It's got two antennas, one for pitch and one for volume. And it's it was used a lot in the Universal films of the 30s to kind of create the sound of the alien, the wee. That and you can actually mistake some of the way the violins are played and mastered and mixed in the Twilight Zone for a theremin, but a theremin was never used.
Okay, I thought I remembered something unique about the theremin. Dave, did you want to jump in about the music since we're there?
Well, the first question is, well, I've got two questions. One's about the music. Why is it so creepy? Why does it work so well? Why does it stick in our brains, that iconic little ditty that we get? And then also about Rod Serling. I want to know, why did he work so well in that series? I mean, his voice is, again, iconic as the music itself. So whichever way you'd like to go, Reba, those are my two main interests here.
So when you're talking about the little ditty, do you mean like the opening do 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 do? Okay,
Yeah,
so that's an interesting thing that I am still trying to work out. There are about 3 different stories as to how that theme actually came about, and 2 of them are from the guy who wrote it. So one is that the first season had a completely different theme by Bernard Herrmann. And one story is that Lud Gluskin, who was the music supervisor at CBS, wanted to change it out and had a contest where people would submit a theme, and the prize would be money, and you would actually wound up getting your theme on the show. And the story goes from Marius Constant, who was the composer of that 2nd to 5th season theme, that he submitted and he got the prize money, and we have the episode theme, the series theme. There's also another story floating around from a magazine that there was a contest. He submitted it, never heard anything about it. Until somebody was in Paris, which is where he lived, and there was some American tourists that he came into contact with, and like he mentioned his name, and they said, "Oh, you're the guy that wrote the Twilight Zone theme," and he says, "What are you talking about?" He had never heard it, and didn't know that his theme was being used. The problem with both of those 2 stories is that there's no evidence that there was ever any contest. And there was also the problem of, well, did you win the money? Or did you not know what was happening? Like, the other story, which is probably the most likely from what I've been able to ascertain, is that as far back as the 1940s, CBS, when they were in radio, had a music library that they set up where any music cue that was recorded for any radio show would then be put in the library. It could be recorded in multiple different ways, and then it was cataloged so that it can be reused. And the same thing happened in television. So there were also random little cues that were not specifically written for any episode, but they were written for the library specifically. And the theme was replaced, I believe, late in 1959. And this is important because if you actually look at the theme and you break it down, the theme is comprised of two different library cues. And these library cues were in the CBS library as early as 1957. So 2 years before the theme was even done. And if you look at the cue sheets, which give you a lot of insight into like what cues were used and how, they actually specify on the cue sheet Twilight Zone theme, including and the name of these two cues. I think it's Étranger 3 and Milieu 2, or it could be one's 2 and the other one's 3. So actually the cue sheet doesn't even really say Twilight Zone theme done. It's Twilight Zone theme, including with these two cue names. So what we think probably happened is that they were in the library. I think, oh, I can't remember who it was. Somebody working with Gluskin was responsible for trying to scour the library to see what could work for a theme. Found these two cues, essentially dubbed them together and created the theme. So I think that it was it's Bruce Broughton. It was who was supposedly, and when I think it was someone had asked him if he remembered doing that, and he didn't remember doing it. So memory is, we're like 60 some odd years out now. But I think one of the things was with the library, the library had catalogs, and the catalogs were broken down into moods. So moods and style. So you can get like the cliche, there's like Indian music, African music, but then you can get like suspenseful, moody, outer space. And so usually what the first trick was to figure out what mood you wanted, and then go into the library, figure out what cues were there under that mood, and then listen to it and see if it fit. And so my suspicion is that whoever was compiling those two cues together was trying to find a mood that would fit the overall theme of the show, went into the library, looked under that mood, found those two, thought that would work together, and created the theme. So to answer that question that you posed, I think it's partially because when composers were mostly composing for the series, whether they were composing for a specific episode or they were composing for just generally for the library or even for radio, because we have a lot of instances of radio music being used in the Twilight Zone, that it was fit very, very well to what the series was going for. And it just really worked. And I think those particular two cues together, namely the one that goes do 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 do, is one that really is kind of like an earworm. And I think that was something that they probably thought would work well for a theme that would be very memorable. Because essentially the whole crux of a television theme is something that you can associate with the show. And I think that was a really wise choice. So whether or not the third story, which I think is probably the most likely is true, I think that it was a good choice. Much better than the original Furman theme, which was kind of like very hazy and had no real melody to go with it, that you couldn't actually hum it. As for Serling, I think Serling, he was just a really tremendous writer with a really tremendous imagination. And I think that this was really a good choice for him because he could exploit lots of different genres within the suspense, science fiction, fantasy, whatever you want to call it, because people call it different things. But also like fusing in things like comedy, but also that Henry twist that comes at practically every episode, and kind of setting that standard, so that even though he wrote 96 of the 92 of the 156 episodes, he really set that standard for what the series needed to be.
And
One of the things I think I heard about Rod Serling is how driven a guy he was, and maybe that's the fact. It looks like every time I see a picture of him, he's got a cigarette in his hand. I don't know how he was a pretty heavy smoker, which may have contributed to his death, from what I've been told. So talk about that being driven and how that worked to his advantage or disadvantage as the face of the Twilight Zone.
Well, I will say that for specifics about Serling and kind of his work ethic and things like that, there are really two fantastic books that anyone who's listening to this who might be interested in Twilight Zone should listen to read. Is one is Anne Serling's As I Knew Him, which was her kind of memoir about her father and growing up with her father, and the other one is Nick Parisi's As Timeless as Infinity, which is a huge compendium of Serling's life and works. It's not Timeless as Infinity. I can't remember what it is. Whew. But it's Nick Parisi's book, and I can't think of the title right now. But Serling always made time for his family, but he always was overworked. There were stories about him drinking lots and lots of coffee to try and get himself going. He would spend hours in his office trying to get writing done. And I think that Hollywood put a lot of pressure on him, but he also put a lot of pressure on himself. And he famously said that, when he died, he wanted to be remembered as a writer. And that says a lot about his character. And he was just someone he was not, as far as I know, very thrilled about being the face of the Twilight Zone. He did it, but he wasn't originally planning for that to be the case. And Night Gallery also is a little bit along with that too. And I think that's one of the reasons that Night Gallery was such a, it wasn't a failure, but there were problems with Night Gallery, at least, because Serling didn't really have the control that he wanted over Night Gallery. And then there were lots of issues with what Jack Laird wanted and like adding things in. And so people were also expecting Night Gallery to be a lot more like Twilight Zone than what it was, which ended up being essentially horror. So, I mean, Serling, there was a lot of pressure on him, and he tried to do the best he could, and it was just really difficult. And so I think that for him, at least when you get toward the 5th season, you can almost see the burnout in the episodes that are there. And I love some of the 5th season episodes. But you can tell, like, after having the 4th season of hour-long episodes that he was forced to expand from 30 minutes to an hour, and then having to go into that 5th season where it was kind of failing, and you can see that it was a lot on him. And so he could really keep that work ethic up much more without burning himself out. And I think that was part of the issue.
How many seasons was the original Twilight Zone? 5?
Five. So seasons 1, 2, 3, and 5 were all 30-minute episodes, and then season 4 were hour-long episodes.
so did Rod did he act at all on the show? It's been so long since I've seen it. He didn't appear, did he? I mean, he's the narrator, but
he appeared at the beginnings of episodes. There's one episode where he actually breaks the 4th wall. I think it's A World of His Own, where the main character is Gregory I can't think of his last name, is inventing characters by talking into his dictaphone, and they become real. And at the end of the episode, Serling comes back, which is very unusual for him to be at the end of an episode. And he's sitting on Gregory's desk and he's talking about, you know, this is all fiction. And Gregory comes in and goes, "Now, Rod, that's not a very nice thing to say." And the whole thing is like, in order to get those characters that Gregory has created to go away, he cuts the film off the dictaphone and throws it into the fire. And so when he says to Rod, "This is not a very nice thing to say," he takes an envelope out that says Rod Serling that has the tape in it and throws it in the fire. And Rod goes, "Oh, that's showbiz," and then disappears. And then you hear his voiceover for the end. That's the only episode that I know of where he actually breaks the fourth wall and kind of almost becomes a little bit of an actor. But other than that, it was just usually at the very, very beginning that we would see him. And I think that started, I want to say started midway season 1.
Okay, well, his voice, can you talk about his voice in terms of, Dan mentioned that he was a heavy smoker. I wonder if that played into the quality, sound quality of his voice. His voice is so distinctive. I mean, you just hear a couple words of it, you go, "Oh, that's Rod Serling." What can you tell us about the quality of his voice? I mean, how did that work in the show also? Would it have not worked with somebody else, you know, with that not having that kind of voice? How important was his actual voice to it?
I think it was quite important, but it wasn't something that they actually intended. I think what happened was nobody else, trying to remember the exact timeline, but I think at least one, I think Vincent Price may have been asked to be the narrator. And so it's Vincent Price, we all know, like, very distinctive voice. And I feel like there was one other person who was asked to do it and who I think did the pilot. But then he didn't want to do the others. And so CBS decided they needed a narrator. And so they asked Serling to do it. And he was kind of like, "Are you sure?" And so it just so happened that he did have that distinctive voice, but that wasn't really planned.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the kind of the chicken and the egg. Was it his voice that created that feel, or was it, you know, just the fact that he was the voice that was there and we all associated that with the show and the feelings that went with it and the emotions? And so you study music theory, right? I mean, why
Music history.
music history? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sure though you have some thoughts on theory. And
Yeah.
the question is, you know, we at Anomalies, we kind of try to dig a little deeper and beyond the usual questions, the history questions, all that. I want to know what's your you mentioned the library, the archives or whatever, that certain types of music or little ditties were categorized according to mood. And I want to know why a certain type of music creates a certain type of mood. I mean, what physically is going on with the vibrational quality of the music, for example, and whether, you know, the theory that I've heard, the model that I've heard is that minor notes create sadness, or minor chords create that feeling of sadness, that feeling of like it's a baby crying, you know, the wailing, the sounds of sadness. And you know, do you think, is that an accurate way to characterize music? Is that, are we mimicking sad events in our lives, sad experiences that mimic real life sounds? Is that why certain sounds create that mood?
So that's a really complicated question, and
Yeah.
for a few reasons. So one, I think this is really what's kind of driving this too, is that, and this is what I find so fascinating, is that to a certain extent, the picture that goes with the image is what kind of helps us create whatever that mood is. And so there are multiple instances where music that was in the Twilight Zone actually originally came from Have Gun Will Travel, or House on K Street. Later on, it was used in Twilight Zone music was used in Perry Mason. And so this was something that I really grappled with a lot when I was doing my Outer Limits work, which is most of the music from the first season of the Outer Limits came from a Western. And so when I listened to the Outer Limits music, like if you were to go back to listen to an episode of the Outer Limits music and watch it, you would think this fits perfectly. And then if you go and you watch the original episode, which all of them took place in Stony Brook, which was the Western, at a rodeo, you would think this really seems out of place. Like, what caused Frontieri to write the music for this that sounds like this for a rodeo, but actually works really, really well for the Outer Limits? With the Twilight Zone, that problem isn't really there. So a lot of the music that comes from, say, Have Gun Will Travel, which was a Western, works equally as well in the Twilight Zone, even the non-specific Western episodes. And I think that, again, it was all about the composer writing for a mood rather than necessarily for a picture. And so when they're making these decisions, sometimes they're looking at the catalog for moods, but sometimes they're being really arbitrary. So for instance, if there is a character named Laura in the original whatever show that was, and then the Twilight Zone has a character named Laura, they'll just throw that Laura music from the other series into this one because the name is Laura. And sometimes it works really well and sometimes it doesn't. But sometimes you'll listen to the music in the context of both of those different series and those different episodes, and they work equally as well because of the mood. And so a lot of this has to do with how the brain processes music. And I can talk endlessly about this because I was actually asked to co-teach a class last spring with a biology professor on music in the brain. And like all of the different physiological things that happen to your body when you listen, and how the brain processes music. And so, yes, we're all conditioned in many ways. And some of this has to do with the very basic musical training we get as kids, where minor is sad and major is happy. But to some extent, it has to do with the way that the music is constructed. And so some of it is cultural, that we automatically can differentiate between major and minor to a certain extent, and then kind of ascribe that emotion to it. But there are other devices in music, specifically in film music and television music, that have become coded for certain things. So for instance, minor seconds. So probably what's most familiar to people is the theme from Jaws. Do 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 do. That sort of minor second has been coded ever since about the late 1950s, early 1960s as music that represents danger. Or ostinatos, which is a repeating bass pattern, has been coded for an unseen threat. So we have these little musical devices that get reused. Harp playing, like harp glissandi and things like that. All of that is usually used for either dream sequences or flashbacks,
or
and
heaven,
so
maybe,
or heaven, death, that sort of thing. And so again, you're even doing that, and you're seeing that a lot of this has just been so driven into us specifically because of the image on the screen that we automatically know what's happening or think we know what's happening. Claudia Gordman, who we think of as the mother of film music studies, has a really famous passage in her book Unheard Melodies where she talks about you can be in a completely different room in your house and have a movie on, and it could be a movie from the 1930s, and you would immediately know when there is a woman on screen, because that very lyrical romantic violin music would tell you that there is a beautiful woman on the screen. And again, so this is stuff that happens. It's always happened in film. They kind of set these standards, and composers have followed it. So I think this is a lot easier when you're talking about film and television music and even video game music than just kind of regular music without any text or music without any image. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it works so well, is because not only are they using these musical devices that have been long established, but also pairing it with the image has kind of helped us to concretize that in our brains.
Yeah, I think there's some other very iconic horror, John Carpenter, you know, and well, just Dan is much more familiar with the directors, producers, the musical scores written for, Halloween, and what's some of the other ones, Dan, that that are very, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th. I don't know if they have specific themes. I can't think of them now, but Carrie, all those, they have similar hooks, catchy little things that as soon as you hear the first couple of notes, you go, ooh, creepy. And I'm wondering, I'm really trying to get at, is there like a physiological basis? I understand what you're saying, Reba, in that it really depends on the visual accompaniment and also what we've learned and what we've gotten used to over decades. Like you said, Jaws, of course, everyone knows that. It's there. You hear it 2 notes in, and you're like, oh God, I'm creeped out. So, but a physiological basis, you would think it would be reasonable to say an up tempo, it represents a quickening heartbeat or something like that. I mean, there are some rules where that really does hold true physiologically. It really gets you pumped up or something, or a slow, a ballad, are there rules that are fairly, or does it really depend so much on other, the context in which it's played for us?
So it depends on context, but it also depends on the person. So there are some people, for instance, when we talk about physiological responses, there are some people who actually get goosebumps when they hear certain music.
Yeah.
And then there are people who don't, or they get chills, or they don't. And for some people, that's a physiological response that happens due to the processing of the sound through their ears into their brain. And I think that for some people, that's also helpful. Some people might not necessarily get those reactions if they're not watching a film with music, but some people will get like just listening to the radio and they'll hear something and will do that. So I think it's about context, but it's also about the individual person. So I am one of those people that have a hard time sitting through horror films. And then I know, like, my mom has a friend who like watches them because she laughs at them and she thinks they're the funniest things ever. And so, like, again, like, it's an individual response to this. So I think that also plays into it.
Yeah, that's amazing how flexible our brains can be in the, the way now that you point all those things out, that there really are no hard and fast rules. Now that brings, I'll let Dan talk here, but this brings me to my next question. We always have to have a bit of a conspiracy bent here on Anomalies, and I want to bring up the idea that the musical scale as we use it, A is 440 hertz, is that right?
Yep.
The note A, well, there's some speculation that it used to be 432 hertz. And I've actually heard some music that was based on that, and supposedly it's different seeming and it makes, gives a different physiological response and whatever. I don't know if that's scientifically researched or anything. There's something special about 432, and you go back and look at, there's a lot of stuff about why that would be significant, but I want to know what is your opinion on that? How did this musical scale get established in the first place? Do we really know?
Okay, so for a very long time, there was no standard pitch. So if I said, let's sing a song and we're going to sing A, Dan, give me an A, and you sing a C sharp, we're like, there's your A. And that was your A for that purpose. After that, what happened was people started realizing and discovering that if you're going to play together, you kind of have to have a regular, an established note. And so tuning systems were developed, and tuning systems were problematic because some instruments were capable of doing certain tuning systems for certain reasons. So for instance, the big example is there was one tuning system where the interval of thirds and sixths would be in tune and your fourths and fifths would be out of tune. There was another system where your fourths and fifths would be in tune, but your thirds and sixths would be out of tune. And so if you were playing with lots of instruments, you needed to make sure, one, that what intervals were in the piece, so that you knew what tuning systems you would be playing that would keep those intervals in tune, but also the capabilities of the other instruments around you. And so there was, for a very long time, up until probably the middle of the 18th century, which is where we start establishing equal temperament, which is a system that we have now where A is 440. For a very long time, there were different temperament and tuning systems. So A was 430, 32 sometimes. Sometimes it was 415. Sometimes it was 410. So it really depended on the instruments that were being played. The other thing too is that instruments were built in what we would call chests, so that they were all tuned together in the same system. So if you had to get recorders, you would buy a chest of recorders so that you'd have all of the parts that you would need, and they'd be tuned to each other. And so if you were to play with somebody who bought a recorder from a different chest, it might not necessarily sound very good because it would be in might be in a different tuning or temperament system and not necessarily tuned to the instruments that were in your chest. So what equal temperament did was standardize the tuning system that we have now. But for a while, it wasn't necessarily important for that to happen because most of the music making that was happening in courts or kind of wealthy environments where people had access to instruments, and not very often would people be coming in without with their own instrument. They would be using the instruments that were provided to them by the royalty because average people couldn't afford them. They might have been able to play them, they might have been able to learn them through apprenticeship system, but they didn't actually own them. And so equal temperament became this thing out of necessity. So for a while, A was lots of different things depending on whatever tuning system you were using.
Cool, that's good history. I didn't know any of that. Makes sense though. Well, Dan, you go ahead and ask some questions. I'm not going to monopolize like I try to every time.
Why not, Dave? You
don't
guys
know.
are kind of talking about things above my pay grade, so I'm gonna bring it back to the more sociological stuff I'm familiar with. So both The Outer Limits and The Twilight Zone are anthologies, but they seem to have a really different quality about them. One of the things, and I think you and I talked about this on The Outer Limits, I was really drawn to the bears, which are the monsters in that particular series. I don't sense that in the Twilight Zone. Just a totally different. Talk about the not the quality, but the content and differences of content from The Outer Limits to the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think was very much deliberate with The Outer Limits was having the bears be scary and being like this big looming thing, whether it was a plant or an alien. Twilight Zone, not so much. And I think one of the reasons why there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not people call it science fiction or fantasy is because in many ways, it's what could happen. We don't know what could happen. One of the things I absolutely adore, and I always like, whenever I talk about this with my students, I get to this point, their eyes glaze over, which is number 12 looks just like you, which is the episode where when you turn 18, you have to go and pick out a pattern for a body because everybody basically has to look like everyone else. And my students get really into it until the opening monologue, where Serling says, for the want of a better estimate, this is the year 2000. And then I lose them. Because here we are in like 2023 and they're like, okay, next. But this thought about it was conceivable that these things could be happening with the advent of technology in 2000. Things like nuclear war. We were in the middle of the Cold War at that point. Like, it was very feasible that we could get bombed. It was very feasible that aliens could hypothetically come in from outer space and kind of try to find intelligent life, or use us for experiments or whatever. Because we had those stories of extraterrestrials, that whether or not they're true is another thing. And so this is stuff that was relatable. And Serling in many ways was trying to be kind of relatable. He always said that you get Martians to say things you can't get senators to say on television. And so there was always a moral to it. There was always some sort of a takeaway. So for instance, what Monsters Are Do on Maple Street, the whole takeaway was like, just let them destroy themselves. They'll do a really good job at it. And again, this was in the throes of McCarthyism, where people were essentially like, you're a communist and you're a communist and you're a communist. And so we were essentially, as humans, destroying ourselves by pointing fingers. You are another. There's lots of othering, like, oh, you're not from around here. Are you a Soviet spy? And we see that in The Shelter, for instance, where there's the satellites flying over that they think is a bomb. And there's only one shelter in the neighborhood, and all the neighbors try to get into the shelter. And immediately when the neighbors are trying to do that, one of them says, you're a foreigner. And so again, this idea that you're not belonging. And so he and the other writers were really pulling from contemporary issues, because Serling wanted television to say something. He always made this comment about like dancing bunnies selling toilet paper. That was one of his famous things. And he just hated this idea of artificiality. He wanted stuff that was going to be relatable and dramatic, and would just be good storytelling. And some of this was just also pulling from his own life, like the stories about war. He was a paratrooper, and the war really, being a paratrooper really affected him. He had a Purple Heart from an injury that he sustained. He walked with a limp. He was getting tired of the rat race of Hollywood. So then you get things like Walking Distance, where he's really, or Stop at Willoughby, where he's really like showing how Hollywood is affecting him. So with Serling, I think that that's really one of the things that he strived for that was way different than The Outer Limits. The Outer Limits never intended to have a moral. They never intended to have a twist ending. They always kind of bordered on the horror of the bears and the horrors of what could happen. With Serling, it was never about the horror. It was about the reality. And I think the way he framed reality is, if an episode was scary, the reality is what made it scary.
Yeah, to me, when
Good insight. Go ahead, Dave.
that just before I forget, Reba made me think of why I appreciated the Twilight Zone so much. It stood out to me, and to many others. I was a kid then. Well, I was probably watching reruns now that I think about it. The series was what did you say?
59 to 64.
So yeah, it would have been in reruns already. I'm born in 69. But it just always seems so nightmarish to me. And I'm trying to think of why is it like bad dreams? Because I guess they're varying opinions, but I would think that as we moved into the 70s, it turned into hacker slasher films. I mean, the real jump scare type stuff and the slashing and blood, and can understand that because the special effects got better. You can make dead bodies look pretty real, and you could show violent acts that were pretty scary because they looked genuine. But prior to that, everything was pretty hokey, in terms of special effects. And I think the reason Twilight Zone worked, because it did, like you said, it stuck to psychological thriller type themes, not necessarily enemies coming to get you, or slashers, sneaking in the middle of the night. And some of the themes that I detect were like fear of loss, fear of being deceived, facades being, wiped away. Maybe the fear of artificiality, like you just said, Serling was, he had an intense dislike for artificial things, commercialization of things and masking of true emotions and ethics and stuff like that. And the other thing is just, some of our worst nightmares are when you wake up or when you think you've gone crazy or something. When you think there's other things controlling your mind or whatever. Is that accurate? I mean, does those seem to be the themes that run through something like Twilight Zone, which again, in contrast to The Outer Limits and a lot of other shows, is that one of the things? Am I close on that, do you think, Reba?
Absolutely. And even now, like looking back, like one of the things I've been talking a lot about with my students recently is the use of artificial intelligence in music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I had a great conversation with my students in one class last week and the week before about whether or not our jobs as musicians are in danger because of AI and automation. And I always keep bringing up a nightmare. Brain Center at Whipple's, where Mr. Whipple says, I'm going to keep like letting men go and hiring robots or having robots and automation and things like that. And eventually he himself gets replaced by a robot. Mm-hmm. Who was actually a cameo of Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet. But this idea that, everything's going to keep getting automated for efficiency. And then one day the person who's requesting all of this automation is they themselves is going to be finding themselves out of work because of automation. It's very, very, he almost predicted it. Like, yeah. This is what's happening. Like, I have a really good friend who every time he used to get frustrated, he said that he would quit his job and go work in a toll booth so he doesn't have to deal with people. And then now he says, I can't even work in a toll booth anymore because toll booths are automated. And so all of these things that we thought were safe are not safe. And so a lot of what some of Serling's stories are about are, breaking that safety net that we thought we had. Our neighbors with our, friendly neighbors with the white picket fences in our houses, and everybody, had barbecues all the time. We're safe. Nothing's going to happen until the lights go out.
Right.
Our safety net's broken, or there's a UFO that we don't know if it's a nuclear weapon flying over. That safety net is broken. Our 9-to-5 jobs that we know we'll have that we can go to in the morning is broken. And so a lot of those same things that you were talking about in themes that you identified are really about relatable things. Like, we've all had that moment, like, am I losing it? Did I really did that really, am I? And so, like, again, we've all, some of these are very extreme. You'll wake up in the morning, like, obviously you'll know the woman next to you in bed will know who you are. We hope. But in Serling's world, in one episode, that's not what happens. You wake up from coming back from a party the night before, you think you're in your bed, and suddenly you wind up in some strange bed, in some strange house in a town where there's nobody. That safety net is broken. The expectations of safety are broken. And that's really also a theme in a lot of those other themes that you've described.
Yeah, and that's as scary as any other concept. In fact, it's much scarier, I think, than a monster coming at you or a zombie or something. You take the shotgun and you blow, shoot him in the head and problem solved, right? But waking up in the zombie apocalypse when you went to bed in the normal world, that's a whole other psychological problem that makes you feel like you maybe just went crazy. And that's what I think Twilight Zone really conveyed to me, even at that young age. It's just that feeling of just uncomfortableness, just a little disturbed. I'm not horrified. I'm not in imminent danger, but I've got that little feeling that something's not quite right. and personally, those are the kind of thrillers, that kind of genre that I find very effective. That you find yourself thinking about it years later. That still creeps me out. So that's why it was brilliant in my opinion. But bringing us to 2023, and you were talking about AI, in the last just several months, there have been the whole Chat GPT thing, several engines, artificial intelligence engines that are shockingly realistic. Some of the imagery, now we're talking, you just type in, I want to see a sunset from Aruba, through the eyes of a fly or something. And it writes this whole complicated, draws this whole complicated picture that's more than any artist could have come up with in their own brain, and so how do you see that affecting music? You touched on that a little bit. I mean, do you think AI is, at this point at least, up to par with the composers? I mean, what level is it? Now we know that it can beat chess, people who are chess masters. We know it can write unfortunately, as a teacher, you probably have seen your shares of papers that were clearly not written by the student, but it's very difficult to differentiate even, or now that you can't claim plagiarism, for example. You can't say, I know you did it, because I can't go find that on the internet, but it was generated through AI. And I really feel for teachers, for educators now, dealing with this kind of world where students can just jump over and have something created for them. Will art students and music students be doing that too, do you think?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things. One is it's usually pretty easy to tell when something is written by AI. But also there's also like detectors that you can run it and it will tell you like whether or not it was AI generated. With music though, one of the things that really astounds my students is, as far as I know, they have not released the code for this yet, but you can Google it and you can kind of play around with it. Google released something called Music LM, which is essentially their AI music composer. And they've programmed it such that you can either write in short descriptions or stories or genres or instruments or whatever you want. And it will generate a piece of music based on that. Even a painting, like you could take a painting like the Scream and you can take a description of the Scream and you can write it in next to the picture and it will create a piece of music. And they actually have, if you were to Google Music LM, and I highly recommend anybody who's interested in this to do that, they give you examples of what has happened and with the pieces of music that it's generated. They've also shown you what happens when they run the same command 6 times, the different pieces of music that will be generated from that same command. And so I think right now, judging from what I've seen with things like Music LM, Google LM, it's not too much of a danger. I was telling some of my students, and I teach a music coding class. And so I was telling them about this really interesting conversation I had with my freshman seminar, which for the first, this is about the 3rd time I've taught the freshman seminar. And for the first time, out of the 24 students in the class, 23 are musicians. Only 1 is not a music major. And so we had this conversation about whether or not they think their jobs are in danger as musicians with AI. And interestingly enough, all of the musicians said absolutely not. The one non-musician said, y'all are in trouble. Danger, Will Robinson. And his reasoning was very, very good, which was, it doesn't matter if to musicians this is good music. Like musicians, we can hear the problems a mile away. If people who are not musicians like it and it works, it's fine. And so no matter how terrible musicians think it is, if it works for the general public and the non-musician and becomes popular, we're in trouble. One of the examples that I give is there was a show in Britain called Jukebox Jury, which you can find on YouTube if you're interested. It was a 30-minute show where basically they had guests on Most of them were musicians. They had opera singers and pop singers and a whole host of other musicians on the show, and they played about a 1-minute clip from the latest pop songs, asking whether or not they thought they would be successful and popular and chart. And more often than not, a lot of the musicians were just like, this is terrible. It's probably going to be a hit. And so it's kind of the same thing. So and so I was telling this to my coding students who were all musicians, and they were just like, it's scary. Like we may not be in danger now, but I think as things get better, it might be problematic. I have a couple of students in recording technology, and there are now AI programs that can like do mixing and mastering. You just tell it what you want it to do and it will do it. Now, again, there are problems with this. It doesn't do things like reverb very well or stuff like that. But again, as it has, and I'm going to start getting all computer-y here, my brain is going to go. As once it gets more access to a corpus of knowledge of examples, then it will get more sophisticated. And that's the thing that people were saying about things like DALL-E with the AI generating for art. Like the more you put online of your art, the more the computer gets into its corpus, and then it gets trained and becomes better and starts stealing things. And that
people won't like to admit this, but isn't that really how we work anyway? Is we don't generate things out of nothingness. We work based on our mentors, our predecessors, our library that we hold in our head of whether it's writing or music or art, art, you're drawing on a database, which is what these AI, these machines are doing. They're drawing on a database. Once the database becomes as big as the internet, once they're opened up, I think it'll be hard to tell between, tell the difference between a human brain and we're really on the edge of something here that's going to be profound, and it will be scary in a lot of cases. It's funny how you said that all the people who did this for a living or planned to were like, oh, no, I'm too creative. I'm too much of a genius compared to a computer. And the one person who didn't plan on having that career was like, you better have a backup.
Yeah.
We all need like about 6 backups, I think, at this point. But it's fascinating. I mean, is there anything you think that that the human mind will hold, superior over the machines? Of course, taking into account that the machines themselves are programmed by the same human minds. I mean, is that right there the catch 22?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, from what I'm seeing, I don't think there's anything that we're safe from. I mean, and even if we go to bring it back to the Twilight Zone, the episode of The Old Man in the Cave, which was after nuclear war, the city was destroyed, and they were relying on the old man to tell them if things were safe, if they should eat certain food that was canned, if it was contaminated, all of this other stuff. And unknowingly, they were putting their trust in a machine. And as soon as it was revealed that it was a computer, they destroyed it. And then there was no one to tell them, don't eat the food, it's contaminated. Don't do this, don't do that. And once they no longer had that guidance, they all died. And so it's also worth thinking about, like, to what extent are we eventually possibly going to rely on computers for our survival? Whatever that means in whatever context.
Yeah, in a lot of ways we do. I mean, our defense systems, we're all glued to our computers and smartphones. I mean, yeah, we won't die if we don't have to use a computer or a smartphone, although a lot of teenagers probably think they would. But still, all of our systems, yeah, it's so intertwined with our minds. I mean, in so many metaphorical ways, not quite yet physical ways, but once we start putting chips in our heads, maybe that's where it's all it's all a foregone conclusion.
I had this conversation with one of my classes last semester, and it was very eye-opening for them. So the university chose midterm week or thereabouts to replace the entire internet in the building, which is aside from being a terrible idea. The course that I was teaching, which is also the course where I had the discussion this semester about AI, is a course called Live Music in the Digital Age, which the whole crux of the course is, in a world where we can go on YouTube or whatever and watch a concert, why should we go and spend several $100s for nosebleed seats to see live music? Like, how can we keep live music alive in a digital age? And so being a course on the digital age and not having the internet was kind of rough. So I took that opportunity to have the students brainstorm what would happen to the music industry if the internet ceased to exist. And they were just astounded at all of the things that they didn't realize we rely on the internet for. Like, oh, you don't know the name of that song? Sorry, can't Shazam it. Want to buy concert tickets? Yep, you got to go to the venue and buy it. Well, there you go. You can't go on the internet and buy it. You know, all of these different things that you can't do. You can't stream music. You can't, you know, X, Y, and Z. And they were realizing like, oh, we actually have to go and buy a record. Like record stores would actually have to come back. Like, yes, they would. No more MP3s. So like getting them to think about how much we rely on technology and the implications that would have, not even just for music, but like pretty much every industry now is reliant on technology, almost to the point where without it, we're handicapped.
Before Reba thinks she's trapped in an episode of the Twilight Zone, what I thought we might want to do to end this up is talk about some of our favorite episodes. I've got one or two. Dave, you probably have one, and I'm sure Reba's got one or two. So let's kind of end up that way. Dave, do you want to lead us off of your favorite Twilight Zone episode?
It's been so long since I've seen one that I can't remember specifically. I just have the feeling that they were all like, you know, you woke up, opened the front door, and everyone in your neighborhood was gone. You know, that's how they all feel to me, is that I woke up, I'm the only person left on Earth or whatever. Although the titles that Reba mentioned, I'm going to go check those out. I think The Old Man in the Cave, it sure seems like I remember that. And then the other was Brain Center at Whipple. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Whipples?
Whipples, WHIPPLE
Whipples.
apostrophe S. Yep.
Yeah, those sound like the ones that stuck with me. Just the theme that Reba mentioned. I'm going to have to revisit them. So you two, please go ahead and, you know, tell us yours.
Well, the one I want to talk about, there's a whole bunch of them. I'm not sure the titles of these, but when they've rebooted the Twilight Zone in a variety of different forms. Forrest Whitaker was host of one. They made a movie out of it. The one I'm thinking about shows up in both the series and the movie, and that's in the series. It was one with William Shatner, who plays the guy who gets out of the mental health facility, and he's on the plane. He's sitting there talking to his wife, and he looks out the window and he sees essentially a gremlin on the wing of the plane, ripping it apart. And every time he gets somebody to come over and look to see what's going on, there's somebody there. So Reba, did that any profound insights into why that
was Shatner?
Well,
That was
originally,
Shatner.
And the Simpsons did a parody of that.
Well, I'm sure
Yes.
I recall on the bus, right, where Lisa looks out and nobody believes her that this gremlin is. I remember that. Yeah, I remember that episode. I didn't remember it was William Shatner though.
Yeah.
So that was Nightmare at 30,000 Feet. And I will say that the latest reboot of the Twilight Zone from 2019 to 2020 also did something not necessarily like that, but they actually buried an Easter egg in there. So that particular episode in the reboot, a guy is listening to a podcast on a plane, and it's basically like recounting a plane crash, but it happens to be the plane he's on. And so he's trying to like warn them that the plane is going to crash. What I love about that episode is the plane does crash. And when the plane crashes, there's a little like gremlin in the water floating as a little Easter egg to the original. And also what's really interesting about the reboot of the Twilight Zone in 19 and 20, which is something I'm working on a project on now, is the way that the two composers who are working on it actually are channeling the original series, and actually taking the kinds of ensembles and the ensemble sizes and some of the even the music from the original series and kind of working it into the reboot, which is really, really interesting. But yeah, Nightmare at 30,000 Feet is one of the episodes in which there's all stock music. So there's music from Moat Farm Murder, which is a radio show that CBS did in the 1940s about a real life murder. And so that music appears in there. A whole host of other stock episodes, stock cues are in there. So that's one of the ones where they sat down, the music supervisor and the music editor, and said, okay, can we get away with not hiring an orchestra for this? Because essentially what happened was, to take a step back, the music union was getting a little bit upset because the music library use was up. And so they said, you know, if people are not recording, they're not making money, and our musicians are basically starving. And so they decided to create this dictum that a minimum of 13 of 26 episodes for a season would have to be original scores, and then the rest could be stock. That people would sit down and decide whether or not it actually needed a score, and if it didn't need a score, then they can just use stock music for it. And so that was one of the ones that they determined that they had enough stock stuff in the library that would work. So that one's really, really interesting, because especially of the pervasive use of Moat Farm Murder. So one of the really memorable scenes is where he's got the window, Bob Wilson has the window covered with the shade, and he pulls it open and the gremlin's like in his face. And that stinger is actually from Moat Farm Murder. At the moment, I think that the character is killed or almost killed in the radio play. So again, this kind of the striking stinger sound from a murder story is now here as he's seeing this gremlin in his face.
Another one that I'm drawn to, and then I'm going to shut up and let you talk about your favorite ones. And we talked about this before, the kind of, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? The fact that a lot of actors in the Twilight Zone show up in the Outer Limits and vice versa. So the first Outer Limits episode I remember is the Galaxy Beam with Cliff Robertson. But then another favorite Twilight Zone episode, and I don't remember the exact name, where the guy is on the wagon train and his kid
100
gets
yards
sick.
over the rim.
Yeah, and he goes over the rim and he essentially transports into the future, finds some antibiotics and brings them back and saves his kid. That was another memorable episode, I thought. What are some of your favorite episodes, Reba?
So I would say my top three, not in any particular order, are Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? Where they're trying to find the Martian in the diner. Number 12 Looks Just Like You, and The Midnight Sun. Those are my three. And if we're talking specifically about the music, my favorite score of the entire series, there's two. There is The Midnight Sun, with the score by Nathan Van Cleve, and The Passersby, with the score by Fred Steiner. And The Passersby is the Civil War episode, where all of these guys are kind of walking past on the road, and there's a woman who is watching these guys, and all of a sudden, like, someone comes and he's playing Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair. And she was saying that's the song her husband used to sing to her. And turns out, as all of these guys are walking past, there's one whose face basically got destroyed. And the guy who had stopped to sing recognized him. And at that point, they realized that they're all dead. And Abraham Lincoln, the last casualty of the Civil War, comes walking by and tells the woman Lavinia, come, because there's nothing left for you here. And then she sees her husband, who also is dead. And that particular one is really interesting for one main reason to me is that, and Steiner himself said this, so this is not speculation, is that the main theme for the passersby that keeps coming back over and over again is actually based on Sergei Rachmaninoff's piece Isle of the Dead. So if you know the Rachmaninoff piece, you can kind of hear it and you can almost kind of piece it together. But once you know that, you realize that that was very deliberate, that he's choosing Isle of the Dead, where essentially everybody is dead. So there's that. And then the Midnight Sun, I think is just an absolutely brilliant score with the very little that they have, because essentially Nathan Van Cleave is basing that on one of those repeated patterns. And it gets faster and slower as things happen. You get reverberation, you get a Hammond organ, you get like all of this other stuff happening in the context essentially of an alto flute, a Hammond organ, and a piano.
Well, I once again, I always tend to be the timekeeper when we do this. I just want to thank you, Reba. The fourth time was the charm for us to connect with you and get this done. Very enjoyable discussion. I hope this wouldn't preclude you from ever coming back and talking about anything else you do, including science fiction movies that you might be into, or horror movies or whatever. But thank you. And tell us again where we can get your books. You've written two of the books on the, well, you've written several. So
I've written several. So my books on the Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone are unfortunately out of print. The publisher shuttered. I am, if I can get my act together, at least going to start putting together a second edition of the Outer Limits book. The publisher people on that are kind of getting on me, and I need to do that. And then hopefully another second edition of the Twilight Zone book will follow, because both of those I found things after I wrote those books. So those you could probably find in a library. As far as I know, you'll find them on the secondhand market. My third book on music and the atomic bomb, which talks a little bit about some episodes of the Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone, that's available through Peter Lang Publishers, or you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local library. That came out in 2020, so that is still in print. And I've got an edited collection co-edited with my fantastic colleague, Catherine Reed from Cal State Fullerton, who, if anyone is a Jeopardy fan, might recognize her name because she was the musicologist who was the contestant on the Professor's Tournament. We co-edited a collection on music in Twin Peaks.
Wow.
And that is available through Routledge, our publisher, or Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. So that's where you can get my work thus far. And I'll keep you posted when the Lynch book is out, the David Lynch book.
Oh,
very good.
David Lynch. We could have spent 2 hours on Eraserhead or something. That was one of the movies that screwed me. I still have nightmares about that movie, and I last saw it like 20 plus years ago.
Well, I'll tell you, I was telling Dan before that one of the struggles I'm having with editing this book is that it's a part of a series on directors and their sonic styles. And I have to write on David Lynch's sonic style, and I only have 50,000 words, including footnotes.
Wow.
Which is like 100 pages or so.
Yeah. Sounds like a lot, but not when you really get writing. That'll go by pretty
Talking about Lynch.
Yeah, boy, he's one of a kind, I think, in terms of
Talking about an anomaly
that he can stir up in our brains. Just creepy stuff. Well, I would really like to, talk to you again in the future, especially about, well, David Lynch, but also things are moving so quickly in the AI field. I mean, it really feels right now that things are hitting a fever pitch, and everyone's going to be out there throwing their AI into the ring and see who's going to come out ahead. And I'd really like to talk with you, months down the road, sooner or whatever, but, when you really feel like it's hit you in your profession and where you see it going, because we need as many prognosticators as we can in this place, people trying to predict what this will mean for everyone and everybody's career. Luckily, I'm at the end of my career, and Dan is already retired, so I could just stand by and watch it all happen. But it must be it's a little bit of a scary thing.
Yeah,
To
definitely.
think that computers can have that much influence, unwanted or maybe unintended in some cases. Be fun to talk to you about all that stuff in the future too. So thank you, Reba, so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Good to see you again, Reba. Take care.
Same.
Okay,
Yeah.
take care. All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.